I've also taken straight-up women's studies seminars. It's not that dogmatic. Postmodern neo-Marxism? What the hell does that even mean? It's a contradiction in terms.
100% Jordan Peterson. Yo, what is going down? Welcome to another episode of Owls at Dawn. After a long hiatus, we are just two dudes from Southern California who study philosophy, politics, and religion around the world. Decided to start a podcast that we would sometimes record and sometimes choose to take months break off so that we could bullshit without impunity. Or with impunity. See, look, I even fucked up the intro, Troy, but we're just going to run with it. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori, and I'm wondering, Austin, when does a short hiatus become a long hiatus?
Like years, I think, you know? Like, how long did Guns N' Roses take in between their albums before they did Chinese Democracy? Like 10 years or something?
Did Chinese Democracy even come out?
Yeah,
I think that's like a Mandela effect thing.
I think it came out. It was like 20 years, so that's a long hiatus.
Yeah, I think we have like a short to medium term hiatus.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Although, you'll have to take this on my credibility here, listeners, but Austin is literally a mountain man right now.
Yeah, I'm growing out that beard. I decided to go full hipster / hobo. Bohemian hobo chic, is that a thing?
I'm sure it is in Europe.
Perfect. I'm living that life right now. This week we are going to be talking about, I guess it's an essay. It was a blog post, article thing that Troy sent to me about one person's experience in two different philosophy classes, but it opens up to much broader, more kind of relevant cultural implications that hopefully we can delve into. Especially Troy has some firsthand experience in both of these types of environments, where I probably have experience more in just one of the environments. So it'll be really interesting to open up, talk a little bit about philosophy, a little bit about culture and shit like that. But first, in case y'all forgot, we got to start with the shitty minute. And it is Troy's turn to rant for 1 minute about something that is just chapping his hide. And it could have been over the past couple of months, or it could be from today, or it could be something that he's anticipating. So T-Roy, what is your shitty minute?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this simple. My shitty minute is an anticipatory shitty minute.
Oh, see, I just made that up. I didn't even think that was a thing, but okay.
Yeah, you called it. So apparently, not only is Mel Gibson making a Passion of the Christ 2, which is a hilarious thing to think about, there's also a movie coming out, I believe this year sometime, called Paul the Apostle of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm going to anticipate is that this movie will be terrible. Almost surely will be terrible. I think the director is a guy who's done a bunch of these new religious-themed, like, for evangelicals only type films. Not so much, not the God's Not Dead type things, like the purely, laugh out loud affairs. But movies that are suited for a particular audience and not necessarily supposed to be works unto themselves.
Sure.
Or at least I'm sure the authors of these things would dispute that remark. But I kind of see it that way. I think most people see it that way. Anyway, my shitty minute is basically to say you could make a really great movie out of the life of Paul. I mean, it's got all the great emotional hallmarks. You have a guy who literally murdered people, who was a fanatic, and he ended up becoming converted to the very group that he was persecuting so heavily, and then leading them and changing that movement from the inside out to, again, eventually become one of the world's most dominant cultural forces in history. So that's a pretty remarkable story.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you also have this person who copious theological and you could consider maybe even ethical writings that you could dive into, and what would the person's mind behind that be to undergo not only these transformations, but these intense periods of thoughts, who was imprisoned for many, many years. There's a lot to work with here. His disputes with Peter would obviously be fantastic to show in cinema. And I'm sure most of these events will be shown, but they will not be depicted as a complicated, interesting individual, but rather as a kind of one-note individual with basically no inner conflict other than the I did bad things, but now I don't want to have done bad things. Like a very simple notion of forgiveness that you sometimes see in evangelicalism.
The scales have fallen off my eyes.
Yeah, it's a very binary look at how forgiveness works and how transformation works, which is, of course, not how anything works from the mind. And I'm just upset that this is going to be terrible, and it's going to reinforce the idea that Paul's just a kind of boring one-note character, or possibly even a villain.
You think it's going to make him a villain?
No, but I mean that's the kind of traditional. Isn't the traditional? That's how most, I would think, people from the secular side of things would see Paul, right?
Oh,
He's the one who institutionalizes Christianity from the pure apocalyptic ethical religion of Jesus.
Right.
And
yeah, unless you're, no, you're right. I was going to say, unless you're like Bishop Spong or something like that, in which case he's like a repressed homosexual, which would be a really interesting way to do this movie, Affirm Films.
That'll be directed by the guy who did Alexander. Blonde Paul.
That was Oliver Stone.
Oh, that was Oliver Stone? I didn't know that. I actually do kind of want to see Oliver Stone's Paul. That'd be pretty great.
I'm pretty sure because that was like one of his big blunders, is that Alexander, not only was it bad for Colin Farrell, but also bad for Oliver Stone. I'm pretty sure.
Dude, the first act of the Paul movie, directed by Oliver Stone, would have the greatest like murder scenes and gangster scenes ever. That'd be awesome.
That would be pretty epic. Yeah, I mean, so this company, Affirm Films, they're known for making like low to mid-budget spiritual films, I guess you would call them. But the thing is they target very well and they market to a very niche Christian evangelical audience. And then, of course, some people are going to hate watch it, right? And then, of course, a lot of evangelicals are going to take their friends to this as a sort of tool for the possibility of conversion, which I was dragged to the Passion of the Christ, actually, by my parents the first time, and I think that was their intent. But these films make a really good return on investment, which is crazy. I mean, there's actually a really alive, like vital and robust subset of the film market that is these faith-based, spirit-based films. I mean, so you have the Hallmark films and shit like that, but you have some production companies and I guess little studio houses that are making these films, and they're churning them out, and they're making shitloads of money, man.
Yeah, it's crazy that, the flip side of the ability now with niche marketization and all that to make small-scale indie films, and for them to be profitable enough to make, is you also have these niche films from all these other little niche markets. Yeah. As well, that you may have no idea even exist. And they can make a good return on investment.
Yeah, and the worst part about getting a good return on investment is that they're just going to keep making more. That's the problem. It's not, I don't give a shit about profitability and people getting their money back or anything like that. It's the fact that this is just going to continue. They're going to continue to make these, I don't know, maybe potentially culturally harmful pieces of media. Because remember, did you see that series that was on the History Channel? Maybe I think it was called like The Bible.
I don't think so. No.
It came out. Gosh, I want to say a couple years ago. I know there was a guy named Devin. Gosh, I want to say Devin Shaw. Somehow we were connected in the past. He's an actor in LA, but he's like I think a Christian actor, and it's like produced by Mark and Rona. God, I can't remember their last names. But he's like a huge producer, like fucking Survivor. Mark Burnett, maybe, I think, and Rona, I think that's his wife's name. But they produce these big, huge, like epics about the Bible or about Jesus, and I think that these films are sort of in a similar niche market. So I don't know. We did have a good discussion the other day about if we could do our own version of the life of Paul, that we'd do like a heterodox version, and that sounded kind of fun.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. In the same way, I'd want to make an HBO prestige drama about like Athanasius's gangs that murdered Arians and shit.
That would be awesome. Or you could do one about like Calvin's Geneva, where he's like burning motherfuckers and like drowning Anabaptists and shit.
Dude, yeah, do an anthology series. Just call it God's Gangs.
I love it. Okay. Well, we'll get on that as soon as we have time and the ability to do so.
All right, so with the shitty minute in tow, we're going to move on now to our main segment, where we're going to discuss a blog post on the website Heterodox Academy. And the post is called, A Tale of Two Columbia Classes. Now, I think it'd be helpful just to read real briefly kind of the key paragraph or two. Do you think that'd be appropriate here in this context?
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty short read anyway, so you could probably read most of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very short, and I just wanted to read kind of the key thing. A lot of people have taken issue with this post on the left, kind of continental philosophy circles for certain reasons, but I want to approach it from a different way. So I'll read a bit of the middle part of the post here. So okay. The basic context here is this author, who I don't know who this person is, Coleman Hughes. I have nothing to say about who that is, whether for good or for ill. But he's at second-year undergrad at Columbia University, and he's taken two courses that he finds a bit of a contrast in, both under the philosophy umbrella. One course, excuse me, is a kind of traditional philosophy course on method, and the other is a critical philosophy course on feminism. And for the first course, the traditional philosophy course, he says that they read some philosopher, say Thomas Nagel, and learn his arguments well enough to repeat them, and then spend much of the class exposing any weaknesses that Nagel's argument might have. We don't hold anyone's views as sacred or even special. We debate with one another. I even argue with the professor at times. The prevailing mood encourages friendly but lively debates. It's challenging, good-natured, and fun. He then moves on a little bit later to talk about the other course, the more kind of critical theory type course. And he says, in this course, we read some philosopher, say Foucault, and learn his arguments, but rarely does a single person even ask a question, to say nothing of making a critique. On the exceedingly rare occasion that a student asks a question that could potentially contradict what's being taught, the professor has a mysterious way of answering without ever suggesting that the argument could simply have a weakness. And that's kind of the key couple of paragraphs there, and he goes on to explain even further what he sees as the problem with that setup, but I think it's pretty clear. It's implied in those paragraphs, even the more descriptive paragraphs that I just read, what the issue is from his point of view. And that's that there seems to be in the academy two different kinds of philosophy that are done. One is more aligned with what we'd call analytic philosophy, which deals with the logic of arguments, critically analyzes them, and then compares them to other arguments, and tries to see which one is supported, has the best supporting premises, follows your more traditional logical form, and everything's up for debates, or I should say, everything that's being discussed is up for debate. Whereas the latter is more the critical theory, or cultural theory, or just plain capital T theory perspective, where certain theorists are kind of read to be explained. And there's no sense of arguing whether or not the author actually has a good argument, or criticizing that argument, but simply explaining what the argument actually is and how it pertains to culture at large. The example of Foucault being kind of the key one there. Now that I've kind of explained that issue, what do you see here in this bifurcation between these two types of philosophy?
So there are a couple ways, I think, to approach this blog post. One would be to take it at a more maybe superficial level. I don't want to say superficial, but let's just say a surface level reading, and say that there are different methodological approaches in these two orientations towards philosophy. And so that's one way to look at it. And then maybe the more interesting way to look at it, I think, is to look at this blog post as being an observation of particular cultural symptoms that are very in fashion right now on the interwebs. And so when I first read it, two things popped into my mind immediately. One was that it just seems like the author is making a very similar argument to a lot of either centrist liberals or conservatives that are sort of displaying some form of resistance to quote-unquote cultural Marxism, or as Jordan Peterson has popularized lately, postmodern neo-Marxism, or to the radical left, or to the, what are they sometimes called? The regressive left, right? So it seems that it has a little bit potentially of a reactionary motivation. But at the same time, I also don't want to dismiss somebody's account just because I'm catching a hint of reactionism. So that's kind of how I first encountered the text when you sent it. From the first perspective, like the classroom, the methodological approach, just from a more academic perspective, I didn't really ever experience the pure analytic approach, except maybe in undergrad. But it's hard for me to really say that you and I had a very similar undergrad experience because we went to the same university and took a lot of the same classes. Definitely had the same professors. I'm not sure that our philosophy professor, who was like really the only philosophy professor, I'm not sure that our philosophy professor. Well, I guess he would have, right? Because his classes were opened up. He was and it was one of the things that was actually really sort of. I take this back, or I take back what I said a minute ago, because his classes were very open compared to the more dogmatic and rigid approaches from the rest of the university, right? He allowed experimentation. I remember I read Sartre for the first time in his class, and that was something that you could not imagine taking in one of our theology or reading in one of our theology classes. I mean, people freaked out when you talked about Rudolf Bultmann or Karl Barth like you were a fucking heretic going to hell, let alone some like atheist existentialist who literally made a career on the idea that God is dead. So, yeah, we read Nietzsche, and so there was much more of a, here are the arguments from these philosophers, what do we think? But the problem is it was always front-loaded by the confessional disposition that aligned with the school's confession, that aligned with the school's theological orientation. So even then, it wasn't as open-ended as I think that this author is trying to make it seem that his methodology or practical class kind of exhibits. So yeah, so that means that most of my experience, or it's either that type of philosophical training, or I'm definitely in the more critical theory tradition. Like all of my education has been in continental philosophy departments. So that's kind of I'm going to be skewed in my perspective. With that said, I had a very different experience than him, and it could have just been the way that I approached things, because obviously sometimes you project things that will give you a different type of return, if you will, on your attention investment. And so maybe I was just oblivious to certain dogmatic approaches, but from my perspective, I didn't experience that in my continental classes. And I took a straight up women's study class, where that draws the ire of all the sort of centrists and all the conservatives as being sort of just straight up dogmatic stifling of speech and just hammering you over the head. So I don't know. That my experience was a little different from his, and so I was resistant a little bit to some of his ideas, but nevertheless, I don't want to ignore him, and I definitely see some validity in what he's saying if you kind of step back and survey the broader cultural and academic landscape a bit. But what about you? What were your first takes, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's right to say that if the sort of depiction given here in the post is true and accurate to the nth degree, then there is a problem in that second class. Right. But I've never experienced anything like that. I've also taken straight up women's studies seminars, grad seminars, and they're not like that. It's not that dogmatic.
Right.
There's no, I mean, any professor who yells at their students kind of for being idiots, for not knowing something that they haven't even been taught yet. I don't know. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't want to get into psychoanalyzing the author or anything, but.
Well, I was going to say, you didn't read that bit, but that was in the article that he recounts, that like the teacher actually did yell at somebody for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. And that just makes no sense. So at that point, I think everyone would agree that that's not, if that's true and accurate, that would be an example of poor pedagogy. Right. At the same time, I don't even think you need those things to make the point that the author was making. And that's that capital T theory way of doing philosophy is very different methodologically from your traditional analytic philosophy form of doing philosophy. They are different methodological approaches. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And there's kind of, for me, the way I took it is there's two responses that I've seen, usually pretty much on Twitter, which is, of course, the worst form of kind of developing nuanced arguments. One is the reactionary position, which we've talked about, which is usually how I've seen this addressed. And I have no idea if this is what the author meant to do with it, but this seems to be how people have taken it. Many have taken it. And that's that capital T theory is dominated by feminists and Black Lives Matter and whatever else. Postmodern neo-Marxism? What the hell does that even mean? It's a contradiction in terms. But anyway.
100% Jordan Peterson. Like, if you knew anything about the history of French cultural theory, you would know that Foucault was not a straight-up Marxist. Like, he had a very tense relationship with the PCF and with straight-up communists. And to this day. Like,
Lyotard, I mean, you're talking about the greatest meta-narrative is dialectical materialism. But anyway, the point being, the reactionary position, I think, is obviously wrong for all sorts of reasons. But it's the response to it that I've been also a bit perturbed by, and that's sort of to say that, the kind of cultural theory or capital T theory way of doing philosophy is just a different form. It's just a different thing. And so we shouldn't at all think of the two as being maybe even philosophy. It's just a different discipline. So keep them separate. And you see that quite a lot as a way of sort of mitigating criticism of the capital T theory side. And I do think there are issues with that methodology. As I think there are issues with the traditional analytic philosophy model. I think they both have inherent critical weaknesses to them that the other points out. And it's a shame that the two aren't able to exist in a healthy tension. That it's always this unhealthy version of a tension, for the most part, that subsists. So, for instance, the capital T theory side can point out that analytic philosophy, as much as it is very good with rigor and with concise logical arguments, has all sorts of biases about how the discussion began, about the meaning of certain terms, and about language, and about philosophy's relation to science. All sorts of things that are just assumed to be the case and tend to be held by all the usually white men who are in the audience. And oftentimes that sort of hegemony can lead to very clear discussions and, minimal progress, but eventual progress in certain areas. But it also leaves a lot out. Capital T theory, oftentimes in a way to grasp all those things that are left out, becomes so broad as to be almost unmanageable. And not make really any discernible progress. They're both critical weaknesses, and I really wish there was a way that the two, although they speak different languages, could communicate. I really do think it's like two people trying to talk about the same thing in different natural languages, and just being confused over their cognates, so to speak.
So I have an unformed theory about this, at least in the way that I approach theoretical concepts or theoretical topics. And I tend, obviously, to be much more influenced by the capital T theory as you've identified it. And for me, I think that capital T theory is much more what I would call affirmational, whereas analytic philosophy, quote, unquote, because what does that mean? But analytic philosophy tends to be a little bit more dialectical in the Platonic sense, not in like a Hegelian sense. And so what I mean by that is that analytic philosophy is much more interested in no topic is ever out of bounds for continuing to explore and to unpack and to open. And even though there are some, like you said, biases that are just ideologically affirmed, those things go unnoticed oftentimes to a large degree. But the point is that that there's sort of like a critical distancing. As a matter of fact, Paul Livingston, in his book, he refers to this type of orientation of thought as criteriological or sometimes constructivist. And it's the idea that a sort of, if we can, let's draw a circle around all the stuff we can talk about. And so those would be all the concepts, the topics, the themes, the historical events, whatever, that are subject to philosophical scrutiny. They exist inside that circle, but the observer exists outside the circle as an objective, analytical analyst. Sartre refers to this type of reasoning as analytical reason, as opposed to what he tries to develop in his book, The Critique of Dialectical Reason. But so analytical reason, criteriological reason, or constructivist reason, and this is actually developed first by Badiou, I should say. Badiou calls it constructivist, I believe, and then Livingston calls it criteriological, but it might be flipped. But either way, that's the point, is it's criteriological or constructivist in his mind. And it's that idea of a circle that's drawn, and then the philosopher is outside. And so any orientation of thought, or any orientation to the relation between thought and being that fits that type of approach would fit under that category. I think that the approach that I would place most, not all, but most capital T theory into is trying to get away from that. Not that it all gets away from that. I think sometimes even continental philosophers are still stuck within that criteriological / constructivist approach. But it would be one that's affirmational, but that is also self-deconstructive at the same time. And so rather than the observer being external as an objective analyst, the observer, him or herself, is actually on the boundary, not inside the circle. Obviously, this is a sort of analogy, so don't press this too far, this visual analogy too far. But if there's a circle, the thinker, the subject, would be on the barrier, and the barrier itself twists and turns and changes its shape as the analyst is participating in and is being changed by the content of analysis, let's say, or the content of theory. So that would be more dialectical in a Hegelian sense, right? But I think, so for me, then there's this affirmational approach. So the reason that continental theory a lot of times doesn't indulge as much in the same type of argumentation as typical Anglo-Saxon philosophy classes, analytical philosophy classes, is because it's much less about the argument for the argument's sake than it is about the argument is a way of approaching a state of affairs or a huge set of circumstances, so a structural critique. So rather than just trying to see if the methodological approach to the analysis of the structural critique is important, what's most important when studying Foucault from this perspective is understanding how he approaches his structural critique, right? And then figuring out the useful ways that structural critique can then be expanded, rather than simply trying to sit there and say, his approach to disciplinary society is completely wrong because he insufficiently understands propriety-power relations, which would be like a Marxian critique of Foucault, right? Foucault's focused too much on like knowledge power and not enough on property power, something like that. But you do get that in theory, like, so it's not completely excluded. You will find that. And then you will find people that try to bridge the gap. Jacques Bidet is somebody who's actually recently done this on Foucault. He wrote a book called Foucault with Marx, where he's taking a seemingly, oftentimes described as like an impossible gulf between Foucault and Marxism, and he's trying to bridge the gap a little bit. So you will see that. But I think, does that make sense, the way that I kind of have made the distinction that I think that between these two orientations?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure I'm fully grasping the circle analogy, but I think I'm getting at what you're going with the constructivist approach. Okay. Let me see if I can kind of riff on that, and you tell me if I'm going down the right avenue here.
Okay.
I do think that there's some sense in which analytic philosophy is dealing with a traditional set of problems, and you don't just introduce a new problem into analytic philosophy. You riff on old problems and create new problems out of them. So there's a pretty strict set of kind of discursive elements you're allowed to use in order to be considered legitimate for debate. And so the author of this post, for instance, uses Thomas Nagel as an example. I like Thomas Nagel a lot. I think he's a fantastically great philosopher. And not exactly the kind of paragon of American analytic philosophy either. This is a person who questions, like, Darwinism and things like that. So he's certainly not one who just follows sort of the rules of the popular thinking of his time. But Nagel does. I mean, you think of like Nagel's View from Nowhere, like I think his most famous book. It's a chapter on all the most famous problems of philosophy and taking his approach to it. And there's some novelty there and some new stuff to think about, but it's mostly the traditional problems of philosophy. And you compare that and contrast that with something like Foucault and concepts like knowledge power, and that's not going to fit anywhere into the traditional analytic philosophical canon. You wouldn't be able to introduce that. You just literally cannot introduce that in a way that would be legitimate for debate in analytic philosophy circles. That said, I do think Foucault can challenge certain views in, say, epistemology, or even like a more kind of public version of epistemology as practiced, or applied epistemology maybe, and then applied epistemology can respond to it. I think there can be dialogue between those things. They would need to sort of work on translation and have sort of interlocutors that are able to speak both languages, which just seems very difficult to find that. But it does happen. You think of like Galen Strawson, who wrote a famous text. I'm blanking on the name of it for a minute. It's a short essay where he talks about the self, and whether or not the self is sort of a static entity, or if there really is such a thing as a sort of individual person who survives every moment. And he takes a lot of stuff from straight up Buddhism in this short little essay, and a lot of things from continental philosophers, and he translates them into analytic-ese and does so well. And it's a very perspicacious essay, and I like it a lot, as much as I don't really agree with the conclusion. I think you can do that. Badiou attempts a somewhat similar thing on the other side of the aisle. Not quite sure how successful he is, because I don't know the mathematics as well as to sort of compare. But I think such a thing is possible. It's just not done very often.
Yeah, it just requires, as you said, a lot of translation work, and that's frustrating. It takes patience, it takes a lot of humility, and philosophers are not known for that. I will say this, so without getting too off the track here, I was in Italy this past summer, and I spent a little over a week, with a range of philosophers. And we had 4, let's say, large characters in the current tradition of both continental and analytic philosophies. And let's say one figure straddled, he does a lot of work kind of actually trying to do some of this translational work, who's actually Paul Livingston. But there was one analytic philosopher who, his approach was quite different. He was very argumentative, he was very bombastic, and he spent a lot of time not doing the sort of typical continental type of approach where somebody makes an argument and somebody goes, that's interesting. That's kind of like this, and it could potentially be to that, and maybe it's this. Could it also be this? That's like the continental thing, right? It's like you never fucking say anything, but you're always like, interesting. So it could be this, it could be that. That's problematic, but here's this, and it could be this argument. And this guy was like, no.
Really quick. That's the same thing in analytic philosophy as arguing about how to represent an argument with logical notation, rather than discussing the actual argument and its merits.
Right. Yeah. So this guy, who's actually a pretty famous logician, basically his approach was more, no, you're wrong. And he was very bombastic. And I remember I sat around with a lot of the graduate students and young career academic researchers, and a lot of people complained about this particular individual because they thought that he was an asshole. And I understood where they were coming from, but I also kind of just understood that he had a different argumentative orientation, and that he's used to going to analytic philosophy conferences and logic conferences where literally it's let's make your argument and make your case. And so a lot of times there would be people in the audience, because this was a seminar format, and people would make questions, and he would challenge them, but very pointedly, which I don't necessarily think is wrong, but he would challenge them very pointedly, and then he would force people to create an argument, and he would press them and keep pressing them. And then sometimes if they did say something that might have somehow contradicted his initial maybe thesis statement, he would just sit there and say, I'll accept that argument, or I got to think about that more. And he would just leave it at that. Continental philosophers never shut up. So there's always another theorist to think about. There's always another approach. There's always another angle. There's always some other layer that can be peeled back. Whereas for him, he would kind of be like, I'll accept that. And I remember us sitting there and we were like, what do you mean you'll accept that? Like, keep going. Like, keep talking. Which was a very interesting way to do philosophy. So, I mean, that was just kind of, I know that's a little rabbit trail, but that was my experience of it. And it was definitely interesting to see these two worlds come together and try to bridge the language divide, so to speak. And like I said, a lot of people thought he was an asshole, so I don't know how successful it was all the time.
No, I like that a lot as a paradigmatic example of the form, even if in that singular instance it didn't work so well, because I think it's a great way to think about kind of theory and analytic philosophy. One won't shut up and the other stops before you get to the interesting parts. Because that's exactly the two weaknesses, just pictured in sort of duration instead of content. Your continental philosophers, like, they just keep riffing and they keep having a new thing to compare it to without ever getting at sort of what's the crux of the real issue there, right? Or develop an argument that you can actually use and then move on to the next thing. Whereas analytic philosophers often talk about some niche object that they actually come to some conclusion about, but it don't mean shit. Or it's just like, there's so many ways I can challenge that, but just not in the language that you're allowed to speak in this particular venue. So I do think that displays the critical weaknesses of those two positions, of those two forms, and that a real helpful way of doing philosophy is to combine those in a way and to put them both into conversation. It's just, you're talking about two different cultures at this point, not just two different forms. And it's so hard to speak across cultures nowadays since we have these really developed languages that are intercultural. And I don't know, politically, I don't know how you could possibly make this happen on a large scale, but I do hope that I, for one, and you know, you as well, can be people who are conversant in both sides and can bring ideas from both sides in a way that is more helpful in the long run.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, that was what was so wonderful about this week-long set of seminars, is that it did bring together a pretty diverse group of theorists, and for me, it was one of the most formative intellectual weeks that I've had in, you know, my life. You know, that week was just extremely profound, and even though some people didn't enjoy that one particular academic's approach to things, those of us who kind of fought through it, even though it was like a lot of times it was a group of people sitting around a table complaining about him, we nevertheless actually engaged with his material while we were complaining about him, you know? So maybe there was something productive about it in the end. I can't help but think that, and I know this might be a little bit too oversimplistic, but I can't also help but think if there's something essentially political about capital T theory that is absent in analytic philosophy. And this is obviously a generalization, because I do think that there is something political in analytic philosophy as well, but I think it's much more of an ideological presupposition, something that goes unnoticed a lot of times, sort of a more centrist or conservative orientation to social systems and to the world and to politics. Whereas capital T theory is essentially political, and I think in a way, it almost could be boiled down to, and I don't want to just be overly rhetorical here, but I feel like it almost could be boiled down to a sort of deconstruction of the very ideas that we hold near and dear, whereas analytic philosophy presumes them and doesn't really deconstruct them. Now, I know you mentioned this earlier, but I think this is really important to kind of focus on, because so going back to the circle analogies, the thing that's different is that for analytic philosophy, the observer is untouched by the analysis. The observer stands outside, and so reason oftentimes, or language oftentimes, is presumed to be a tool that is reliable. And if it isn't reliable, at least they can talk about the unreliability of it in a way that is reliable. Whereas I think the continental approach is a lot of times like swimming in a sea of confusion, and there are no foundational bearings that allow us to fully have an absolute fixed starting point. And I don't know if that's entirely true, because obviously from an epistemological perspective, there are non-foundationalist thinkers within the analytic tradition, kind of the coherentist tradition and things like that. But I do feel like there's almost a foundationalism that characterizes analytic philosophy that is absent in the continental school, because the continental school essentially is about deconstructing those foundations. Do you think that that's a little too hyperbolic?
Yeah, I do think that's a major difference between them. But at the same time, I think there's a sense in which you can acknowledge that everything is political and that you can't talk about things like epistemology or free will or ethics without ignoring the political side. If you do that, you're not really talking about it.
Right.
That's sort of what the capital T theory side would probably argue, right? But I do think you can say everything is political, but also I'm not going to talk about that for a sec. Or I'm going to analyze this specific concept away from that, fully acknowledging that something needs to be said about that in relation to what I'm saying. So, for instance, I'll use this analogy. Imagine you're like in a relationship with somebody, right? Like a friend or a spouse or something, and they like pull a dick move on you, and you're talking about, like forgiveness and reproachment and all that kind of stuff. And someone like brings up in the middle, well, that being an X or Y, a part of my identity is constructed, and so my behaviors are sort of based upon or outflow of these constructed identity, and go into like some capital T theory ease.
Right.
That's just no. I mean, are those things true? Absolutely, they're true. But no, not right now. Right now, we're talking about something that matters between people of close proximity, right? And so different sort of rules apply, even though those rules are sort of fragmentary and they're constructed for this particular purpose, and they obscure certain truths that are fundamental to the way that we behave and are, that you can still do that. The problem is when analytic philosophy pretends that once they've said their piece, like the conversation's over, it's time to move on to the next thing.
So basically dating a philosopher is a pain in the ass, is what you're saying.
What?
So basically dating a philosopher is a pain in the ass, is what you're saying.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine. It would be horrible. I would never date me.
I would date you, Troy.
I would date you if you shave.
Deal. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I don't really know where I ultimately come down. And this is going to be my totally flippant answer. And it is that I never want to suspend my capital T theory orientation to lived experience, even in those conversations with someone that's in my close proximity. But at the same time, and this is maybe a strange tension to hold, but at the same time, I also realize that everything is ideology, and sometimes you just got to live the fantasy, and so fuck it. And so sometimes you just suspend it. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. What do you mean by live the ideology?
You just fucking live it, man. You realize that monogamy is bullshit. You realize that, but fuck it. It makes you feel good, and you really do care about this person, and you're totally immersed, and you're feeling all these happy chemical feelings, and you just fucking deal with it. You just ride it out.
Wait, you realize that the relationship thing was a structural analogy. I wasn't actually referring to the content.
Oh, oops. But that's kind of what I mean. I think that I think everything is a construction. That doesn't mean that there is no objectivity within construction. But if that's the case, that doesn't mean that you can't still like my sister's getting married in September. And she has asked me to officiate the wedding. I'm going to officiate the wedding. And when she asked me, I got teary-eyed and I cried. And then, if you ask me in my more philosophical moments, I kind of think that marriage ceremonies are bullshit, But nevertheless, there's still something beautiful about two individuals who are, living this ideological fantasy.
So
it is that saying, that Lacanian saying that I know that you and our friend Gus in undergrad wanted to make into a T-shirt. That's just enjoy your symptom. And I do think that this kind of maps onto the analytic and continental divide, in the sense that you kind of have to believe the fictions that analytic philosophy think are real sometimes, you know? So, and you do that for practical purpose. It's a pragmatic purpose. Even though, language and social forces and power structures are influencing even the way that we approach whatever said topic is, nevertheless, you can still indulge in that ideological construction for pragmatic purposes, because sometimes you just got to get shit done.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's a great way of thinking about it. I also think that on the reverse side, you can read Heidegger and he makes stupid ass logical mistakes that could have been avoided if he didn't write in the fucking douchebag way that he did. So the same applies on the other side, where sometimes rigor and concision can absolutely help even a continental philosopher or a theorist develop their argument better, because they are making arguments, even if there's some classes where maybe someone never lets an argument be actually broached. They are making arguments, and you can dissect them as arguments, just in a different language and with a different method. Yeah, I think that's all I got to say on this issue.
Well, real quick, before we close this up, what do you think about the sort of the cultural milieu of the moment that seems to influence much, maybe, and obviously I know you said earlier you don't want to psychoanalyze this author, but that seems to maybe influence what the sort of perlocutionary effect is of this blog article, where so many people are racing to engage with it, either to call it reactionary or to sort of defend theory or something like that. Like what are your thoughts on the sort of political implications or cultural implications, and how do they relate to the present moment and some of the debates that we're having now about free speech and about the relationship between the left and various other discussions that are going on in the Twitter sphere or blogosphere and the news media or whatever?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a huge question. We could do a whole episode on that one. But I mean, I guess the bite-size response for me on that, you tell me if you agree with this. If anybody says not everything is political, just respond by saying, look at the comments of that comment or that claim, right? Because almost everybody, it seems like, at least everyone who gets publicized, right? Welcome to the way that Twitter works and social media. Everyone who responds to this blog article is taking it very, very politically. Even those who are saying not everything is political. They're taking it as, but there's a side out there that wants to make everything political, and we have to politically stop them from doing that. It's like, well, then you're claiming it's political, just in an indirect way. It just, obviously everything is political. That doesn't mean that the discussion is worthwhile, because arguing about whether it's political is a stupid ass discussion that's not getting anybody anywhere other than retrenching them in their own sides already. But it's clearly, I think, proof that there's no sort of apolitical conversation in philosophy, really, when you get down to it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think everything is political anyway. I know that this is a hot topic, especially in continental circles. But, the laptop that you choose to buy is a political activity, and the area of the city where you live and the type of candy bars that you buy, those things are political, socio-political, socioeconomic activities. And so I do think so. I just think that it's on a scale of gradation. So there are differences of degrees, not differences of kind. But I agree. Not everybody does agree, but yeah, I'm with you. I just think it's interesting because it does seem to be, like when you sent me that blog post, nothing that this person said to me was surprising. I was kind of like, yeah, that I've heard that argument from many other people, just in different contexts, maybe, that there's one side that they're just dogmatists who they don't want to listen to debate. They just want to preach and smash you with power, which is something that Jordan Peterson talks about. And I know people might be wondering who this guy is. He's a guy that's having a moment right now, let's say. And he's a clinical psychologist, tenured professor at the University of Toronto, who is he did an interview on Channel 4 recently that really launched him into the limelight, even more so than he had been previously. But he talks about a variety of issues, from like arguments against Marxism to arguments against like nice men, like men being like just too nice. And he talks about how to be a man and how to grow up and how to cope with certain issues. And he talks about free speech. And he is obviously initially launched into the limelight because of his stance against a certain bill that was being proposed in Canada that would force people to use gender-neutral pronouns. And he said that, and that's kind of what made him famous. And then he's kind of just taken that platform and run with it. And but anyway, the argument that a lot of the arguments that come out of like him and Stefan Molyneux and like Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro and a lot of these guys who are these voices in the center right to center / hard right to alt right, whatever. They're making similar arguments about capital T theory, that it is incapable of dealing with argumentation because of a certain weakness or limitation within it. And I don't know if that weakness or limitation is there necessarily. Not that
that's just ignorant, right? I mean, that's no different than the continental philosopher who says all analytic people just argue about language and never actually say anything. Like, then you haven't read it.
Which you hear a lot.
Yeah, which some of it does. And some of the continental theory is the way that those guys talk about, but it's a very small part. They argue about it. There are actual arguments happening and debates happening. And sometimes progress is made, sometimes it's not. Like, it's just, you're just ignorant about the other side if you think that. If you think it's that simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, man. I dig it. What's the name of the website again, the blog?
Heterodox Academy.
Heterodox Academy. Give it an old read, and I don't know. Feel free to yell at us on Twitter if you don't think that everything is political. You're wrong, but you can engage with us.
Performative contradiction much?
Yeah.
All right, so now that we have our main segment over, we're moving on to the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us talks about whatever is bringing us meaning in a meaningless universe. Austin, what's doing that for you this week or this last 6 months?
Actually, it'll be over the last couple of weeks to a month, but really the last few days. So for people listening, and obviously Troy, you know him, the gentleman that hosts the sometimes segment on this podcast, the most often segment, but not always segment, This Week in Hip Hop, reached out to me one time over Facebook and said, "Bro, there's a TV show that I think you'll love." He said, "It's called Lovesick. Have you seen it?" And I said, "No, I have not seen it." He said, "I think it's your new favorite show. Check it out. It's a mix of sentimental and shitty dude stuff, i.e. you, and it's based in Glasgow." So I checked it out after a couple of weeks, and he was right. It is my new favorite show. And basically it's about a guy named Dylan who has his two best friends, Evie and Luke. And Dylan, in the very first episode, finds out that he has chlamydia. So he decides to do the good guy thing, and he makes a list of all of his sexual partners and wants to contact them to let them know. And the NHS gives him like these really impersonal blue cards that you can just like mail out to them. That's like, "Hey, you slept with this person, and this person, was diagnosed with chlamydia. You need to take some antibiotics or whatever." So he decides not to do that because he's trying to be a good dude. And he basically reaches out to all of these girls that he'd had these sexual encounters with. And so the episodes, most of them are based around a different girl that he had an encounter with. And then Luke is his buddy, who is like a big-time like Lothario, and you find out why he's kind of a Lothario. And then, of course, Evie's the best friend girl. She's like the gorgeous best friend, the will they, won't they sort of push and pull between her and Dylan. And I love the show, man. First of all, it's in Glasgow, and they film in a lot of my old stomping grounds. Like, literally, like friends' apartment buildings and bars that I used to hang out in. And, Glasgow's not exactly a huge city, and the film industry there is even tinier. So I'm also seeing, like, shitloads of, like, friends or colleagues and whatnot that I had worked with that are in this. So that's really nice just to see people getting work, for one. But beyond that, it really is. It's a really good mixture of sentimental and shitty dude stuff, and it just goes, like, straight through me, man. So I just finished watching all 3 seasons. They are on Netflix. You can stream it, and I really enjoy this show.
Okay, I have a question, Austin.
All right.
This is a multi-part question because I'm going to make a deduction based upon it.
Okay.
Did you like Entourage?
When? Like,
why does that clarification matter?
Because do you mean like did I like it last year, or did I like it when I was 19 and living in LA with my friend who was a director, and we used to drive around the Hollywood Hills and plot where we would live when we were famous, when we had our own entourage? When?
Oh, I want both answers.
Well, the answer is yeah, I like it even still, I guess.
Okay, because what I'm wondering is, the way you've depicted it sounds like I might be interested in watching this, but if it's basically just Scottish Entourage...
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Pre-conversion, Austin, and I just mean like philosophical conversion, hopefully trying to have a deeper sense of enlightenment, Austin, would not have liked this show as much as Anno Domini Austin likes it. So, yeah.
Okay, so is it like the shitty dude stuff of Entourage, but with the sentimentality of... I don't know, what's the sentimentality show? Isolated.
What's that show? Love on Netflix? Yeah.
Okay, so it's like those two married together?
Yeah, but it's more the vibe of Love than it is Entourage. It's not really Entourage, but Luke is a Lothario, and he's an asshole. But he's pretty fucking funny, and yeah, I think you'd actually dig it, man. I think you could vibe with it. It's not Entourage-y at all.
Okay.
Entourage is so like smarmy and slick and like there's no like what's the brother's character? There's nothing like that, you know. E was always the guy in Entourage that was kind of like he was kind of the more sentimental one, but the main character Dylan is even like way more sentimental than that. He's definitely the lovesick puppy. So, but no, I think yeah, it's good. It's more Love than Entourage.
Okay, you sold me. I'll check it out for sure. I've never even heard of this, so that'll be a fun one to check out.
Yeah, and the thing I love about it is that it's like really low budget, just really simple, mostly handheld cameras, walking around fucking Glasgow or hanging around in a Glaswegian apartment, you know? Like it's really simple, but and it's not like this crazy profound thing, but the acting is fantastic. The Luke character, even though he's totally a douchebag, he's fucking amazing. He's a great actor. And then a musician/actor named Johnny Flynn, who was in a movie with Anne Hathaway, actually, called like One Song or some shit like that was directed by the guy that did Sing Street and Once, John Carney. It was like the film that he did in between, I think. So Johnny Flynn's in it, and then the girl that plays Evie, she was in Misfits, I believe. But she's fucking brilliant. I mean, so the acting from these young actors is probably part of the reason why it's so lovely, because they're just so authentic and it doesn't have the. I mean, it's made by British filmmakers rather than like Marky Mark, you know?
Yeah.
Or Doug Liman or whoever the fuck it was. Doug someone, whoever the fuck it was that made Entourage. But executive produced by Mark Wahlberg and about like his fantasy of himself and his boys, I guess, as they came out to LA. It's not that.
All right, I gotcha. Hey, are we going to do like a show of The Good Place now?
I mean, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Have you watched the whole thing?
I am in the 2nd season.
Okay, so when you finish that, we're going to do an episode on The Good Place, for sure.
Okay, cool. You just want to do it because literally there is a character that is an academic philosopher.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that scandalous?
No, not scandalous at all. I don't know why I said that like it was some sort of like negative. Alright, cool. So now we're going to go into the segment of the episode that is called Bullshitting, where we basically just talk about some shit that either we know nothing about or we don't have that much knowledge about. Now, I do have knowledge of the topic of the day, but I'm sure Troy doesn't because he doesn't give a fuck about football. So we're going to talk about the Super Bowl. Troy, did you even watch the Super Bowl?
No, I literally went to Disneyland yesterday.
Was it like dead quiet?
No, it was a little bit less busy than I think it would have been otherwise. But given that there were fewer dudes, there were more kids. as a percentage of the total overall population there. So it was like stroller warfare.
Yeah, well, I guess that makes sense. Everybody else had the same idea, right? Let's go to Disneyland instead of the Super Bowl, and it'll be quiet and not that crowded.
Yeah, all the wives and kids and effeminates, I guess.
So, do you know what happened in the Super Bowl?
Yeah, the fucking Eagles won. I know that.
Yeah, it was a great game, man.
I saw some guy eating horse shit on Twitter. It was amazing, apparently.
Was that my retweet that you saw? Because I retweeted a lot of crazy shit after.
I think it's like 60 people retweeted that.
Yeah. So, the Philadelphia Eagles played a remarkable game. And afterwards, the city of Philadelphia got destroyed, like everyone thought it would. Like literally, like streetlights got ripped down. The Ritz-Carlton, the awning out in front of the Ritz, I think it was, collapsed because there were like 20 Eagle fans standing on top of it. I saw a guy do a stage dive off of the awning. I mean, like 15 feet in the air, stage dive backwards, just falling. Like remember that Trust game that you used to play where you used to fall back with your arms out? Like he did that into the crowd, like 15 feet below. A guy ate horse shit. A couple cars got flipped over. Some things got lit on fire. I saw a food fight inside of a gas station convenience store with like probably 30 people inside just throwing shit everywhere. I guess that's what you do when you win a sporting event. And I loved it because all these people were like, rioting after you win a sporting event is okay, but like a couple of black people marching in silence is not acceptable.
You know what my favorite part of the Super Bowl was?
What?
The episode of Always Sunny in Philadelphia is going to happen next season about it.
Yeah, I've seen the meme. What is it? The gang
destroys Philadelphia.
The gang destroys Philadelphia. Yeah.
I can't wait for that. It's going to be fantastic. I want to see the gang's role in the destruction of Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, man. That will be brilliant. That will be brilliant. I mean, the thing is, too, is the Philadelphia fans are known. They're known for being the worst
fans.
Sporting fans.
In
yeah,
every
it's not just
sport.
The Eagles.
The Phillies, the 76ers, they are the worst fans.
The Flyers, yeah.
Everybody agrees.
Why is that? Like, when I think of aggressive cities, I mean, for some reason, maybe it's just because it's a smaller city than New York or Boston, but I don't usually think that they would be like just asshole humans. But for some reason, they're asshole sport fans. Why?
It's all the losing, right?
You think?
Because like the Sixers haven't won a championship since the early '80s, I think, like Dr. J, Moses Malone era, and they're the most successful one. When's the last time the Eagles had won a championship?
No, the Phillies won recently.
But I think the Phillies have the most losses of any baseball team in history.
You mean like regular season or in the World Series?
No, like just total losses. No, literally, I think they broke like the 10,000 or it's got to be more than 10,000. Like they have the most losses of any baseball team in history. So they just lose a lot, and they're a bigger population compared to somewhere in in the middle of the country or something. So they want to win as much as New York and Boston and LA and Chicago do. And they don't. So
you think it's just repressed anger?
I guess, right? Just all the losing builds up and makes you just want to destroy shit, and that you can't do it because it's socially unacceptable. In the moment,
and that's how Trump got elected.
And you live in fucking Pennsylvania?
I guess, huh? Yeah, I mean, so you take, yeah.
Like, why do Baltimore fans? Why are they not as bad? Like Baltimore, DC, because they don't win shit, right?
Maybe it's because here's going to be my philosophical take. Are you ready? And I'm stealing it a little bit from something that George Cicciariello Mar, I don't know how you say his middle hyphenated part, but he basically talks about how, why is it that these like shootings and shit happen with white people, and he says because of like white entitlement. So I'm going to say that Philadelphia used to be a big industrial town in a state that was very important and central to the history of America, and now it has been left behind because of the neoliberal America that has destroyed industrial manufacturing. So the city is economically depressed, so it's socially depressed, and therefore the fans and the people are taking out their anger through sports. What do you think?
That's some real heavy bullshit, and I feel like.
So it's white resentment, and by white I don't just necessarily mean skin color, like Caucasian ethnicity, but I mean the power structure. So it's resentment and anger because of white entitlement.
Could very well be. But you know what will happen next year is LeBron will go to the Sixers and they'll win like 5 straight titles.
No, he's going to Golden State, dude, and they're just going to win every game ever for the next 4 years.
Yeah, LeBron will take a minimum contract. I'll eat my hat and various other and sundry objects around me.
They're going to give him part ownership, and so he's not going to care about his contract.
You literally can't do that.
And no, they'll make a deal on the back end. They'll say, listen, we just won't pay you for the next 6 years, but then we're going to give you the team when you're done. We're going to give you part ownership in the team. And he's going to go to Golden State, and they're going to be better than the Dream Team was.
They would be better than the Dream Team, that's true.
So I think that's what's going to happen.
And I will finally be convinced to stop watching basketball.
All right, so since this has nothing to do with the Super Bowl now, I do need to get... We haven't talked basketball, because every time I say we could talk basketball on the bullshitting segment, you're always like, no, we always talk about basketball. But we haven't talked about basketball in months.
We haven't talked about anything in months.
That's besides the point. So we haven't talked about basketball in months. So what do you think is going to happen to LeBron here?
Dude, I don't have no idea. I thought there's no way he'd leave Cleveland on TV in front of a Cleveland Boys and Girls Club. Yeah, and then he broke all their hearts on national TV. I thought there's no way he'd leave Miami, especially to go back to Cleveland. And then he did it. I'm done predicting. LeBron breaks the rules. He does whatever he wants to do. I could see him going to LA. I could see him going to Philly. I could see him going to Houston. I could see him going to all sorts of places. I just have no idea anymore.
Does he leave Cleveland?
I mean, at this point, you got to feel like he is, right? Like, there's just too many dominoes being set up for that.
Okay.
But I could also see them clearing house in Cleveland. You know, trading their pick, trading Kevin Love, getting a whole new cast around him, and trying again. And he signs a 1-year deal. I mean, I just don't know anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, I'm trying not to talk too much about the Super Bowl because, you know, when Tom Brady cries, I cry. So...
oh, dude, last year I had to write a poem in love with, was it Brady?
Yeah.
Yeah, man, we should have had episodes going on because I would have definitely put my bet on the Eagles even though they were the underdog.
Oh, it's too bad. Didn't happen. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. We got... No. The weird thing is I actually don't think they were the underdog going in. I told everybody when they asked me, I said, listen, the Eagles are a better team. They are. Their defense is better. Offensively, I think they've got better players. I mean, the way that the Patriots were better were the quarterback head-to-head matchup, obviously, and then experience, and then coaching. So people, I think, relied a lot on experience and coaching and the greatness of Tom Brady to put them over the top. But honestly, I think the Philadelphia Eagles were just consistently the better team all season. I didn't want to believe it. I remember talking with buddies earlier in the year, and I said, oh, man, I just don't buy Philly. And that was when they had their other quarterback, Carson Wentz. And I said, I'm not buying him yet. But they never let it down. They never let up. I mean, they had like 1 or 2 bad games, but really not really. They were pretty fucking consistent and pretty good all year. I think they were the better team. I thought they were the favorites going in. And I was just thinking that maybe a little bit of that Patriot magic would put them over the top, but it didn't. It didn't because Philadelphia's a better team. And Nick Foles played the fucking game of his life, so pay that man because that was unreal. And their offensive line is goddamn amazing, so pay them too. Just pay them all. Pay the players more. Just pay them. Fuck it. Who cares? Pay
or
them.
just don't play football so that you don't destroy your brain. Also,
yeah, that's the other thing that's really interesting, right? Like all these people that are boycotting football just because of CTE and whatnot. What do you think about that? You don't like the sport anyway, really, but...
Yeah, what is it? 50% of parents won't let their kids play football anymore?
Wow,
and it's
was creeping
it that
up?
High? Creeping up? I may have pulled that out of my ass. I thought I heard that somewhere recently.
Okay.
But it's creeping up every year. Eventually, we'll be nobody.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And then all the athletic kids will play basketball, and it'll be the glorious revolution in sports.
Yeah. Or what if they start playing soccer and then America just has like the most amazing soccer team?
I'm fine with that.
That'd be kind of cool. Yeah, I get down with that. Could you imagine like LeBron James and like Randy Moss and just these like freak athletes from all of these sports that we have playing soccer instead of basketball or football or baseball?
Yeah, isn't Messi like 5'2" or something though?
Yeah, he's little, but he's fast as fuck, man.
All right.
I mean, Cristiano Ronaldo's big, dude. He's big and he's solid and he's really muscular. He'd be like a decent athlete in America. But I mean, that's not Ray Lewis, who's fucking 6'3", 240 pounds and runs like a 4.5 40. You know, like they just don't. You don't have that athlete playing in the La Liga or the Premier League. Not really. You might have like two of them. So
yeah, it'd be a whole different game.
I know. And there's a shitload of money in football, too. So, how did we go from the Super Bowl to basketball to soccer?
We're just sportsing.
We're sportsing. All right. Well, cool. I got nothing else then. Congratulations, Eagles. Philadelphia fans, chill out. You won.
Eat shit, but that was actually a compliment, or like,
Yeah,
that wasn't...
No, like literally. Eat shit. You might as well. Just stop punching horses in the face and eat their shit instead.
Yeah, like, let them eat shit.
Yeah. Was that your Marie Antoinette?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God.
All right, so everybody out there, feel free to join us on Owls at Dawn in the future. We're going to hope to keep up a semi-regular schedule here from here on out, as our schedules are finally kind of cemented for the spring. Please find us on iTunes and give us a review and a rating. 5 stars would absolutely help us get the podcast out. Anything else you can think of?
You can hit us up on Twitter, owls_@_dawn, owlsatdawn.com. You can email us. What is it? owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com.
I believe so.
And I believe that is it. What about you, T-Roy? You got anything else to say?
Oh, you know what I got to say.
What's that?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.